Welcome to RESGEN's Giving Life podcast. Stories and conversations about life in Christ, everyday discipleship, and exploring ways that we as men can give life to others. My name is Tom Henderson, the founder of RESGEN, and I'm super excited you're joining me for another edition of the podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a conversation that I have with Rob Loane, a friend of mine who's helping people discover who God is, who they are, and what God desires to do through them. Rob is the president of Pt.2, a husband, a father, an author, and as I mentioned in our last episode, an excellent communicator and listener. In part 1, which I highly recommend you go back and listen to if you haven't had the chance yet, Rob and I focused on mentorship and how being a growing person is one of the best gifts that we can give others. Well, in this episode, Rob and I dive into the topic of developing deep friendships, both with God and with others. We also talk about what it means to finish well and what the number one predictor is for not being able to do so. Here's part 2 of my conversation with Rob Loane. Rob Loane, it's good to have you back for part 2 of our conversation.
Tom, it's good to be here.
Man, I love it. It's not very often I get to do a part 1 and a part 2, so this is kind of fun to be able to do that. So thank you for coming back. The first one went so well, you said, hey, let's have some more time with Tom.
Totally.
All right. Well, so last time we talked all about mentorship. We talked about just what is a mentor, it truly is for everybody. The best gift that we can give someone else is to be a growing person. And I love all the mentoring work and that space that you work in, Pt.2, a mentoringway.org is a place where people can go and find out more information about all that as well. And,
sure.
But today I want to turn our attention, and I know that there was some overlap in our conversation last time, but I want to talk about just this idea of friendship, specifically deep friendship with God and deep friendship with others, because we were created for both.
Right.
We were created for both. It's not just our relationship with the Lord and all that. No, he gives us relationship with other people as well. But I want to start with just our friendship with God, because like in this in some of your materials, and in particular A Way of Life, you encourage the readers to nurture their friendship with God. And that's like a term for God that oftentimes we don't really think about a lot. I mean, we think about him as like a creator or judge, or, speaking of Jesus, savior, king, sacrifice, all that. But so friendship with God, how do you grow your friendship with God? What does that even look like?
Well, one of the first notions is to realize how much it doesn't start with us. It starts with him. And so it begins to turn the paradigm, which, is kind of a guiding assumption. Almost, I'm a context guy, Tom. So but a guiding assumption to this whole conversation is a conviction that God's already up to something good in the world, in our lives, in our communities. Our primary burden as followers of Jesus is not to do a dance and bear act for God, so he'll do something good. Our primary burden is to pay attention, to cultivate attention. And this is no joke. This is just saying it doesn't make it easy, right?
Okay.
Learning to pay attention to what he's already doing, and then begin to align our lives and join in. Or my colleague says, collaborate, right? And literally the co-labor with. And I think in this regard, one of the things that God's up to, and it's been very clear, is he's been in the friendship business for a long time. There are actually theologians that in the 13th century that began to say, what is God like? Well, God's eternal friendship from all eternity. Father, Son, and Spirit have been in this mutual relationship. And so if you want to ponder that, the book of John would be a great place to read. And what I want you to do is imagine what the book of John is doing is Jesus is teaching us how to be children of God, because he is the Son of God. He is brothering us to learn to be to this Father, and so read the book of John through that lens. Everything he's saying about the Father and the Son, it almost feels codependent at times as you read it. Like, I can't do anything without the Father's approval, etc. But somewhere it turns in the book of John, I think it's in 15 in the middle, where he says, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. And that's one of the ways in which, I mean, it's disarmingly stunning what he's doing here, that there is an intimacy. And so from all eternity, the biblical drama as it's played out is this deep desire that God has to be with his people.
Yeah.
And I think friendship is a word that captures, because sometimes we use the word community, and for so many of us, we don't really have community, but we want it. And it's almost started to become a meaningless word. Whereas friendship attaches more of an intentionality, not like middle school, will you be my best friend? But where all that comes from is, I think, in the DNA of who the Lord sort of created us to be. I mean, even in the garden, Tom, when you think about, like, everyone's partnered off in Genesis 2, and what is the conclusion? Before there's any sin, there's this just awareness that it's not good for man to be alone. And I think that is about more, like, as the theologians I know and the scholars, that's more about the call to community than it simply is the call to marriage. That even in the garden, there was something off.
Yeah.
And it points to the fact that, to that call to community with one another and with each other. The last thing is to imagine in then Genesis 3, what does God's friendship look like?
Yes.
And I just think to hear the kindness of God when he comes into the garden in the evening, as he was apt to do.
I was just going to say, when you talk about that, it just reminded me so much of when he's walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then this great question, where are you? And I think we need to hear that within the full span. Like that's not just a question that happened a while ago. That the Lord continues to, as friend by the Spirit, to do that in our lives. Like, Tom, where are you, Tom? In the middle of all the good things you're doing. Yes. It's not the only question in the Bible that should do that, but it's one that maybe doesn't get as much attention. So I think there are a lot of, throughout the people trying to wrestle with the biblical drama of who God is, the word God as friend and his friendship with humanity, or some of us use the word communion with as a way of, but sometimes that gets loaded because you're thinking only the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or those sorts of things. But the same thing, this deep desire from Genesis to Revelation, I will be with my people. And it's punctuated right dab in the middle by this incarnation of Jesus Christ to be with us, moving into our neighborhood. Yeah. So there's a lot to get excited about with that. Theologically, which that may bore, usually, a good theology talk does not get filled up, right? But reality, to realize, is the God of the universe, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, his ways, his particularity in loving us so uniquely and being our friend is stunning.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. And we use the word awesome so regularly, right?
Yeah.
I remember, especially when I was growing up, man. I mean, it's like, I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles changed the word awesome forever, But as I think about just that the God of the universe desires to have a friendship with his creation, his most prized creation, right? Humanity. There is nothing more awesome that's to fill us with awe than that. And yet, so often, we just really aren't filled with awe.
No.
I mean, and I think that there's times where it can feel almost, well, wait, God is supreme. He is the creator. He's this. And so we don't want to be disrespectful.
Sure.
Especially, irreverent, especially in maybe a conservative Midwest culture.
Sure.
Of which you and I live. I mean, we have listeners that are not just in the Midwest, but it is but that doesn't make it less true. That he desires to be our friend, and that our life is to be this lifelong journey. And this is what Vantage Point 3 and all of your efforts and who you are as a person really is pouring into, is to help people embrace this lifelong journey of growing into Christ,
that's right.
where each one of us answers these three important questions. Who is God?
Right.
Who am I? And what am I to do with
Right.
my life? And what does God want to do in my life and with my life and all of that? And so, I mean, we could do 10,000 podcasts on who is God, but I want to talk about that question, who am I? Because that is a very important question as well. And so especially if we're going to be in friendship with God, understanding our relationship with God, and then also our friendship with others, where we can say, who am I? Yeah. So as you've asked that question over the years, and you've taken people, not just men, but women as well, but specifically, I think just in men, what are some of the things that have come out of that question, or why is that such an important question for us to answer?
Well, I think it's the burden of our culture is where we are a very individualistic culture, and who am I is how we frame things, right? And I think there's all sorts of ways, combinations in which we've tried to answer this. And there's something about living today that we feel the burden of we're the ones that have to answer it. And I don't think every culture has felt that burden. That who you were was, oh, good grief, I'm the son and daughter, or I'm the son of this person, right? And I'm the blacksmith's son. And a lot of identity was more fixed. For us, we have so many options about what we want to do and how we want to compose our lives. And that's just part of the turf of our reality. Now, from a God's heart for us standpoint, and the variety, I tend to think, this is Henry Nouwen, but he says people answer this question in terms of I am what I do, I am what other people say about me, I am what I have. Now, all those things, he says, are important, but they cannot bear the weight of that question. And so for a large part of my 20s and even into my 30s, this was the question, right? I was single, so I had more space than I would now with kids and all that sort of stuff to ask this question. And I think I answered the question as if I was digging a hole and I was going to find a bottom to that hole. All right, that's who I am, and now I can move on, right? Type of thing. And I remember taking a walk in Huntington Beach, and just this was the image. Rob, there's no hole. There's no bottom to this hole, right? And I was walking next to the Pacific Ocean, and there was just a sense of, when you're next to the grandest thing on the globe, like when you hold the globe up, the Pacific Ocean covers the most space. And I'm just walking next to this little portion of it. And it's a big deal, right? And I began to realize that is not a question that you can answer alone. You are my child. You are my son. It is a we question. And it's always, and I've loved you. I created you. Like the very fact that you are, is because of me, like, as well as, I've taken you now on this journey of rescuing you and beginning to shape you more deeply. And so it's a question that is secure in the fatherhood of God. And I trust him that my identity. Now, what I do, what I have, what I say, some of those sorts of things, they are, they're not unimportant questions, but I think we try to squeeze the very life out of those questions to answer this basic existential question that we have a lot of anxiety about. And so people historically who have asked this question, who am I, in the last couple hundred years, always end up around the notion of community, because it's whose are we and who are we? And we're brothers and sisters, right? And we're being reparented by this God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's a new family. And I think going forward, that's a really important distinction. But know that where do we begin in our lives often, these deeper questions? It's often around the question, who am I? In a way that Paul or Jesus, that question didn't have quite the same sort of, it was rooted in all sorts of other sorts of elements. It's our question as late modern, postmodern sort of people that Enough on that. But that's, so we long, right? This identity is expressed at all throughout culture and will continue to be. And how do we begin to be brothers and sisters for others that help them recognize that there's another way than expressing your individuality in this self-composed life? Like, no, you can try.
Yeah.
Right. But it's going to require a lot more help than you have any idea. And
it's way more than just it's the, what I do, what I have, what I
Right.
and it makes me think of the, in this other little book that you and Randy Roos wrote together called, Growing Up, A Lifelong Journey, where, you talk about 7 different conversations.
yeah.
And one of them, and I love the wording of this, it's what's defining you nowadays.
Yes. Sure.
What's defining you nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think that for a lot of us, we are tempted to define ourselves not as a member of the family of God,
Right.
a son of of the Father of all creation, but it is, what we do, what we have, what our what we're good at, or our hobbies, or that kind of thing.
All things that are okay.
Yes, they're not wrong by any means.
We put too much weight into them, and it's like buckling knees. Our identity can't.
Right, because the question is,
weight.
of course, if those things happen to be stripped from us,
Yeah, sure.
then all of a sudden,
Yeah, who am I again?
Who am I again?
Yeah.
But if our identity, which is that's a constant battle, especially in our culture. And so you talk about just living a more reflective life.
Yeah.
And which a lot of times that takes time. We don't want to do that. We'd rather just watch another Netflix show, or just continue with another podcast. Which is, it should be this one for sure. But so that reflective life and reflecting on those things, that in and of itself is a practice. But that too helps develop our understanding and our friendship with God ongoing.
Yeah. No, I think especially nowadays too, where we're drowning in information. It's different. Our growing up into Christ requires more than good information.
Right. And what's the quote?
We are drowning in information, but longing for wisdom. A guy named Edmund Wilson said that. And I resonate with that a good bit, that what is this wisdom? But to live, look, like there are people that just seem to be more poetic or more reflective. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. That might be, some of you, it's not all about whether you've read the last Dostoevsky or not, right? For some of you, that would be a good read, right? I'm just telling you, he's got some things to say that we need to know. But this is not like, usually, where do we, well, I'll add one more quote to this. 2 things wake us up in the world. Pain and beauty. And I think when we're woken up, then we begin to reflect. And I know for me, in my early 20s, a set of events occurred that just sort of knocked the legs out from under me. I would have never thought about myself as a reflective person. Before that point, I would have said I'm a good student. I'm a this, that. I do this well. I would have given you my resume, Tom. Right? But what that did was a series of events occurred in my life in which I just felt like the Lord wasn't holding up His end of the bargain. Oh. That was my reality, and it hurt. I'd never known disappointment as an adult until that moment. Now, some of us, we can try to numb that. And I've not been, I've tried that one. It didn't work as well. Okay. But what I'm saying is that is what caused me to kind of go, what is going on around here? To live more reflectively. Mm-hmm. So it's not like just something to add to my Christian life. It was about drowning, and I needed to survive. So I started to read anybody I could that I thought would help me swim. And along the way, what I began to discover is all these people, men and women, I would lump into, they were Jesus followers, some of them, not all of them, but they lived reflectively, You can't help but read the scriptures and realize, we talked a little bit about this before, but Jesus, he's asking great questions. And if that didn't work, he'd tell a great story. Mm-hmm. And what does a story do is it involves, his stories are not illustrations like we have in church. They're these parables, they involve you, they pull you in. You and I are still trying to sort out whether, I'm in a ditch, or am I the one passing by on the other side, or am I the Samaritan, right? Mm-hmm. And so reflective life is not like just something to add on. Mm-hmm. It is more of a, you face deep need in your life, and maybe you reach out to somebody. Maybe that person isn't alive and they're in a book. C.S. Lewis, very important to me in those years. I read probably half of what he wrote, Madeline L'Engle. So I could get but then fortunately I found out people that were also alive I could have conversations with as well. And I realized, I'm late to the party. This is the history of the church is just strewn with very reflective people that are doing that so they can live lives of grace and truth, not so that they can be known as, the really sharp one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's been my story with, it just came out of desperation.
Yeah.
That I found. So one day, I'll tell one story. This Dr. Houston, I don't know if we've talked about him in this one. We talked in the last podcast about him, but he sat down with me, and I'd often ask him, like, how in the world do you know me so well after just an hour together or something like that? He goes, well, Rob, Lord sends a thief to find a thief. And he said, get to know the thievery of your own heart, and you'll have the grace and insight in the thievery of other people's hearts. And it just was so spot on at the time. I mean, I was deeper into my journey at that point, but it just made sense that here's a person that knew his own heart before the Lord and knew the Lord. And there was a double knowledge to the Christian life, that to know God, you had to know yourself better. To know yourself better, you had to know God. And we get in trouble when we separate those out. Mm-hmm. And so that feels, as you think about this reflective life thing, some of us are stuck, not because we don't know the chapter and verse. We're stuck because we're self-ignorant. We haven't reflected on our lives. And the Lord's patient.
Yeah.
He can turn up too, the more, because he wants you to grow up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And some of that is we're afraid to reflect
Yeah.
because we're afraid what we're going to discover, or we know what's there. We don't really want to uncover some of that. And there's a reality of that. But then just again, knowing the deep love and desire God has for just us to be us. And that I think it was sometimes when we do a couple of these podcasts, I can't remember but we don't have to have the dancing bear, performance hat on.
Yeah.
And especially, we live in a day and age where it's all about performance. And I've mentioned that I'm a number 3 on the Enneagram multiple times on this, where it can become about performance and perfection and all of that. And God says, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
Because the true heart of friendship is to be known.
Yeah,
and fully known, to be fully known by God. And so, but now I want to talk a little bit
about. He
about,
really wants to know you. That's
yes.
the hurdle for some of us, right? Like, no, not that when we really get down deep, we're like, that is not a tame space in our soul.
Right.
No one wants to know me like that, right?
And if they did, they wouldn't want to be around me, or they wouldn't love me. There's no way I would be accepted by God if I was fully known.
Right, and that's the part where I think over and over again, both in people's experience and scripture, you see this is too good to be true. This steadfast, loving, particularizing Psalm 139, the way He loves us uniquely. So
no, that's good. I'm glad you threw that in. So in now turning our attention to like just friendship, deep friendship with each other.
Right.
One of the things that that guys sometimes struggle with is just friendship.
Yeah.
And we tend to gravitate at times towards the self-isolation piece. And, I know that you and I would agree with this, that even the journey in our faith journey is not one of isolation. It's not just us and the Lord, although, yes, I do understand that it is, and we're to stand before the Lord on our own and all that kind of thing. However, but the journey of even understanding God and his love is best experienced as we do that with other people. Right. And other men that are moving in the same direction. So one of the things I remember in your time with our luncheon that we did with youth workers was that you talked about the best predictor of not finishing well. Yeah. And one of the things that you and I have talked about at many times is that we do a great job in churches, ministries, whatever, of attracting people to Jesus. Yeah. But yet then the question is how do we help sustain their walk with him? Yeah.
Sustain their interest.
Yeah. Even,
so to speak.
Even their interest. Yeah. And I think one of the greatest ways, obviously, is just fall more in love with Jesus and develop our friendship. But it's other people walking alongside us that we allow into our lives and to be known. Right. So that was a long statement to get to this whole idea of the best predictor of not finishing well is
isolation as a way of life. Yeah. Like I think and some of this is coming out of Dr. Robert Clinton's study of thousands of leaders, like Christian leaders' lives in particular. And that was his, the presence of, and he used the word mentoring as a broad category, but these relationships throughout our lives, some friendships, whatever, that were part of people who finished well as opposed to those who didn't. And we're going to have seasons of isolation. For some of us, this past year has been a new experience with isolation because of all the pandemic realities, et cetera. But isolation as a way of life, that is just, and just our tendency in every situation is I can make it on my own. And that's just a resistance, right? It's certainly not the case. And it frustrates our lives. So now to identify that is easier than to respond with, well, how do I cultivate that? Yeah. And it's going to involve some risk and sometimes in Christian circles, we can over spiritualize friendship. Like we make it loaded and all that, as opposed to, I remember in college, I didn't go to a Christian college and it's just, you're just having fun, right? Like, and there's something about that's good. And, but in the presence of sort of these soul friendships or people that you can trust over time, and it takes time, is what he found to be part of leaders' lives that ended flourishing and finishing well in the end. And so I think there's an appropriate maybe fear, caution as we share this to just sort of evaluate, reflect a little bit upon the state of your relationships. And it's not, and to get out of our mind the middle school possessive, will you be my best friend? And then, so that's one thing to sort of put on pause. This is different than that. But then the other thing to put on pause is I suppose we could think too much about finding a friend and not enough about being a friend. And so I do think, I wouldn't shove that down someone's throat in every situation, but I do think it is possible for us to go, well, what sort of friend are you? And who in your sphere of influence, needs a call or help fixing some, I mean, I don't know. The variety is all sort of, it doesn't all have to be, we have to have a Bible study, bro, right? I mean, it's just a valuing in who they are that, life, it's too hard to go alone, and nothing, that is part of our design. We weren't made to be alone. Yeah. And so,
yeah, like you said with mentorship, it's not a do-it-yourself project. Yeah. And life is not a do-it-yourself project. But it does take the risk of being a friend, putting yourself out there, and the opportunity to potentially be hurt or taken advantage of or whatever. But it's also about just saying, hey, this is it's important to understand that like we can't do life alone.
Yeah.
And who are those people that I'm being a friend with that they're being a friend to me. Like because at the end of the day, like when things we all have challenges.
Yeah.
And who's going to be there? Who's going to be Jesus with skin on as we go through those challenges?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And we, some of us are, you can't see yourself by yourself. Like you need community, right? And so I can remember.
Can't see yourself by yourself. I like that.
I mean, you can look in the mirror, but that's still a reflection, right?
Yeah.
It's not you. I mean, I guess I can see my hand, but I've never really seen me, so to speak, right? I can recall a few years ago, two friends that were at the table. It seems like I'm talking about this Dr. Houston a lot, but he and his wife were at the table, and one of my friends had a 3-year-old son with him, and then so it was like 5 of them eating lunch, and the other friend who didn't have the son was sitting next to Mrs. Houston, and he was a struggler sort of guy, and he said. Mrs. Musa, I never know if I'm really growing or not. Like, I don't know in this Christian life, am I really growing or not? And she looked at him, she goes, well, of course you don't know if you're growing or not. And she looked over at the 3-year-old, whose name was Drew, and he says, you think Drew has any idea that he's growing? Well, let's talk to his dad. His dad could tell you all the areas in which Drew is growing. He goes, we're a lot like that in community. The more you sort of isolate yourself from community, not only are you cheating others from who you are, you're cheating yourself because you can't see it. Mm-hmm. And it sure seems like, so this is where friendship with God, the people that write on this stuff, and friendship with others, I think are really tied closely. That our capacities to grow in something like prayer. What a North African named Clement of Alexandria said, what is prayer? He said, prayer is keeping company with God. I've always liked that. Very relational way of looking at it. Our capacity to keep company with God, Clement would observe, is also tied to the people we walk with. Like my capacity for friendship affects my capacity for prayer. My capacity for prayer affects my friendship with others. And so knowing God and knowing others is just this, we're marvelous creatures that the Lord's created, right? Mm-hmm. And he deserves the worship. I'm not confused about that. But I do think, we need to walk with one another and discover these sorts of things. And I don't have a bazillion little tips on how that all works.
Right.
That's a prayer. If I had one wish for leadership in the church in North America, it'd be friendship. I think it's a lonely group of high performers, sometimes low performers, but high performers. And we need companionship. And we're strangers to ourselves if we don't have that. And so that's the work of that, Tom, that you're asking it's a lifelong work but also reason to be very grateful as some of you reflect upon whether it's a marriage or it's a good guy friend. Lord, thank you. I don't want to take that for granted. Yeah. Right. Like, so.
Yeah. And that's really good. And I know that that gratefulness thing, we're going to end our time here together, but I know that's something that you have continually asked yourself, and that we've talked about in the past, of just the two questions of, where am I the most grateful? And where am I the least grateful?
Yeah.
And recognizing that, and just out of gratitude, just being okay.
Right.
Lord, thank you. And I think about our last podcast together where you talked about just grieving Randy's loss and just having this attitude. God, thank you for him. Thank you for him. And although our friendship was cut short because his departure from this earth was too soon, but thank you for the friendship that he was to you, and thank you to the husband that he was to Susan, and the father to Liam, and thank you for that. And I think that when we recognize how much that we have in our lives to be grateful for, and then recognize where we aren't being grateful.
And see where the Lord is in the mix of that. Because sometimes, read the Psalms, Tom, and there's, hey, you're allowed to say that? You know what I mean? And there is a place to confess, lament, but for sure, And it all depends on who you are, how you need to hear what we're talking about here. But in general, the Christian life runs on a deep sense of gratitude.
Yeah.
And so that's an important sort of deal.
Well, so this is we need to bring this one to a close, and we're not going to go into part 3. So this is it, my friend. For now, maybe we'll have you back in another season. I know we could talk for hours, and I'm always the benefactor of such great wisdom. You don't just give information, Rob; you give wisdom, and so I always thank you for that. But at the end of our podcast, most often we give something called the final word, where we just give the guest, 60 to 90 seconds just to share anything that the Lord placed on your heart, just kind of as a final word that you'd love listeners and viewers to walk away with today. So you got a final word for us?
Well, I mean, I think is my question would be my final word is who you're walking with. And we got maps. Another person said this to me one time. We have maps and map makers ad nauseum in the church in North America. And what we need is a few more mountain guides. People have been there ahead of us that will walk with us. And I think there's undoubtedly, even in this listening audience, there's some men that have been walking with Jesus for a while, and we need you to step up and walk with others younger. And we don't need you to be experts. And we're these sorts of people too. We need you to love folks and listen and ask good questions. And because what the energy of the Christian life is this: God's already up to something good. And so I often live with this reality, Tom. We never know enough about Jesus to know what he's going to do next. And so I'm on the edge of my seat when I'm operating well. What might you do next, and how am I a part of that? And so who are you walking with?
Yes. Never know what Jesus is up to and how I can be a part of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Boom! That's a mic drop for the final word. Rob, thanks so much for being with me, brother. I really appreciate it. Thanks for imparting this wisdom and this conversation amongst the community.
Blessings,
of
Tom.
the Living Life podcast.
It's a good thing you're up to.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Giving Life podcast. I trust you enjoyed part 2 of my conversation with Rob Loane today. As always, if you found our conversation helpful, I encourage you to share with others that may find it helpful as well. It'd also be a huge gift to me if you'd take a minute to rate and review the podcast, as that truly is one of the best ways for us to continue growing our listening audience. If you'd like to connect with Rob and learn more about Pt.2, check out their website, Pt.2.org. Well, thanks again for joining me today, guys. We'll see you next time on RESGEN's Giving Life podcast. Until then, continue being men whose life in Christ gives life to others.